I want to tell you the story of our first Christmas together. My wife and I, as married couple, I have permission from her to tell this, by the way, so which kind of sets it up for quite a dramatic story, I suppose. We've been married about 6 months, and we wanted to decorate our home for Christmas. We had just a small little house on Pontaluna Road in Fruitport, Michigan, and we wanted to make it our own for Christmas. So we went out and we got a Christmas tree. Now, in Michigan, you don't get fresh trees. A lot of times you just get those fake ones. Oregon trees are way better, just for the record. We get this little Christmas tree and set it up in our living room. We go out and we buy, Christmas lights, and we managed to rummage together a few pretty cheesy little Christmas ornaments. Nothing real special. They were leftovers that we'd found at, a yard sale or something like that. And we set aside a night that we were going to decorate this tree and decorate our home. Now, a little background. You need to know that in my family, when I was growing up, the night that we decorated the Christmas tree was always a big deal. We always, ordered in pizza. We had all kinds of Christmas goodies that we would eat, and the eggnog, and Christmas music, and it was a whole production. We had it all it was just done in a certain way. It was, unwritten rules about how we did this as a family. My wife's family also had a way of doing things that was pretty different. You can kind of see where this is going. In her family, it was more her mom that did it, and she decorated it real nice. But it wasn't quite the same event. And I'm not saying one way's better or worse. I'm just saying they were very different. So back to our Christmas Eve decorating party on Pontaluna Road in Fruitport. We'd gotten underway decorating the home, and the tree was up, and we were starting to put these little cheesy decorations on the Christmas tree. And I started to get pretty critical. Like, you aren't doing that quite right. You're not supposed to be decorating the tree like that. We're not supposed to be, we need to be having some cookies. Where are the cookies? And why aren't we drinking eggnog? And on it went, just like that. And it wasn't too long, and there were tears everywhere, and fighting, and not a creature was stirring. No, not at all. It was a mess. It was a pretty crummy Christmas evening. Now, we're looking, as I said, we're looking at the way the gospel transforms relationships, and we're looking specifically at what happens in marriage. How does the gospel change married life together? And some of you can relate to the story that I just told. Some of you can think back to maybe when you were first married and you actually had fights kind of like that. Some of you, honestly, maybe it's right around now. You're going through a season where your marriage just isn't going very well. Right? You kind of feel like you're either more roommates than anything else, or you feel like you're constantly locked in combat with each other. And so the question is, how does the gospel change your approach to marriage? How does it empower you for healthy, renewed marriage? Some of you you're single, or you're in a relationship and you're maybe starting to think about marriage. It's maybe a year or a few months or a few years off in the future, but you want to be married, and my goal for you and my desire for you is that as we hear God's picture for marriage, that this actually prepares you, that it gives you a framework to think through what marriage is like. And then very broadly speaking, our culture is at a place where marriage isn't really held in high esteem. We talk about marriage in our culture as something that you do when you settle down. And that language there kind of suggests something, right? You go off and you have your fun. You live life for yourself. You have adventures, and then when you get around to it, you settle down and you get married and you do all that other boring stuff. And my goal then is to cast a vision for what God intends marriage to be. And that is something glorious. It's not something we settle for. Now, we're looking this morning at Genesis 2. Genesis 2 is one of a very, very small handful of chapters in the Bible that give us a picture of what life is like before sin gets in the way. Genesis 2 gives us a little glimpse into what the world was like when sin hadn't destroyed and gotten in the way of God's purpose. And so when we go to Genesis 2, we actually begin to get a sense of what does God intend and what does He desire life to look like. You begin to see what He wants vocation to look like. You begin to see what He wants relationship. You get a picture of purpose and meaning for life. And yes, you get a picture of what marriage is meant to look like. You get a blueprint for marriage. And this morning I want to show you from this text, I really want to show you three things. I want to show you that God's plan and His blueprint for marriage has at least three parts to it. The first is partnership. The second, covenant. And then finally, it's a reflection of something bigger. Now, if you look at the text, if you have your Bible still open, I just want to give you kind of an overview of how the text breaks down. You notice that the text starts with God speaking, and the text ends with Adam speaking. And when God speaks, God identifies a problem. And then we go through the text and we find what God does to address that problem. And then when man speaks, he responds by acknowledging the goodness. In other words, the problem has been solved. So in between, so God speaks, there's a problem. God fixes the problem. We end with the solution to the problem. Now, I want you to look, if you would, at verse 18, because when God speaks, what does He say? It is not good for the man to be alone. That's striking. It's striking because, remember, sin hasn't entered the world yet. Creation is still untainted by human rebellion, and yet God looks down and says, there's something not good here. There's something not quite right yet. And there's really two things that begin to emerge, two problems, if you will. The first, God comes out and says it. He says, it's not good that man is alone. It's not good that man is alone. Now, what that means is that you and I are created for relationship. We're created for relationship. We're created for companionship, right? Simon and Garfunkel were wrong. We're not rocks and islands that have no need of friendship. We're created for relationship. Now, let me tell you why this matters. Some of you feel lonely. Some of you cope with loneliness. It could be for a number of reasons. It could be because you're unmarried. It could be because a relationship has broken. It could be because you've lived alone for a long time, and you sometimes maybe feel that there's something wrong with me. And nothing could be further from the truth. You see, loneliness is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is right with you. Do you hear that? Loneliness is because you're made for relationship. Now, this does not mean, and you cannot take this to mean that therefore everyone must be married. But it does mean that we all need companionship. We all need relationship. We're going to come back in a few weeks actually to the whole topic of singleness, because the gospel is something powerful when it comes to singleness, and we'll get into that in a few weeks. But for now, I want you to see that man was lonely and it wasn't good. We're created for relationship. Now, what's the second thing that God finds wrong in His world? Well, it's not as obvious. It doesn't jump off the page. But if you look a little further into verses 19 and 20, the solution that God provides is He creates a helper. Now, think about that for just a moment. If God says the problem is that man is alone, I'm going to create a helper, that also suggests that part of the problem was that man was not complete, meaning he could not do the work that God had given him to do by himself. God puts Adam in the garden and says, fill the garden, subdue it, rule over it, exercise dominion over it, draw out the potential of the world, and use it in such a way that it brings glory to me. But Adam couldn't do that alone. So God says, well, he needs a helper. There's a phrase that's repeated throughout this text. It's that phrase, a suitable helper. That's how the English translates it. Literally, it's kind of an awkward phrase. If you were to translate it literally, it would be like a like opposite. There was no like opposite for Adam. To put it very simply, the pursuit of God's mission and purpose in this world was not something that man could do alone. Doing and living as God called Adam to live was something that Adam couldn't do it alone, and for you and me as well. We are not created to pursue God's purpose and his mission alone. So what does God do? Well, verses 21 through 23 tell us that God creates Eve. He creates a woman. He puts Adam in a sleep, and he does surgery. Takes out the rib, creates a woman, closes the place back up again with flesh, and then brings the woman to the man. And then the man, it's like he can't say it, he has to sing it. He goes from prose to poetry, because poetry has this way of expressing the power of words in ways that prose just doesn't do justice. So Adam breaks into song. He said, "This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." What he's really saying is that God has created a like opposite to me. He's created someone like me, but different. God has created a companion. God has created a perfect helpmate. And Adam delights in that. Now Adam can, number one, he has companionship, and number two, he has partnership. Now, let me break down what this means for us. The first is this. Marriage is about friendship. Marriage is meant to include that aspect of friendship, companionship. We're not intended to go through life walking through the storms and the joys of life by ourselves. We need companionship. We need someone to walk with us. Now, again, this doesn't mean that you must be married, but in marriage, that's what you do. You walk with each other. You face illness together. You face grief together. You share life's joys and triumphs together. But you also build that friendship. You know, when you're first dating, you get all excited because you share some of the same hobbies and you like to go out and do stuff. And, you know, it's not uncommon. You get married and maybe you get busy with your career. You start having a family. You get busy with kids. And it's not uncommon. You stop sharing the friendship. You stop doing stuff together. You stop going out on dates together. And the marriage hurts because of it. Marriage is friendship. Healthy marriages have that foundation of friendship. And if you're dating, if you're in a relationship, let me encourage you to make that the foundation of your relationship, or make that a part of the foundation. Culturally, we do this opposite many times. We get all the passion and all the emotion right away, and that becomes the driver for the relationship. But that's not a foundation that can sustain a relationship. Friendship is part of this. And the second part of it is marriage is about a common mission. God puts Adam and Eve to work, and they're to do this together, exercising dominion over creation, caring for it, drawing out the potential, fulfilling what God calls them to do. And so what a married couple needs to think through is, how is God calling you as a couple to serve together? What is God calling you to do? Now, this does not mean, ask yourself whether or not God wants you to go overseas as missionaries. That's not what it means. It might mean that. I hope for some of you it does mean that. But God's mission is bigger than that. You need to think through, how is God calling you to serve together? In your careers, in your home, in your community, in your church? How is God calling you to serve? And if you're newly dating, or if you've been dating a while, you're thinking about marriage, that's a question you need to answer. And if you can't find the answer to that, if you think God is calling you in opposite directions, that's like a warning sign. Because God is calling you to be partners together in his work in this world. Now, so God calls them as partners. When God brings the woman to the man, then the next aspect comes out, and that is covenant. Covenant. Now, you'll read through this whole text, and you won't find the word covenant at all. So don't look for it. It's not there. But the idea is there. Covenant is being joined together. It's biblically, it's something bigger than a contract. It's something more that deeply entwines you even more than a contract. It's a relationship that's created and grounded in a promise that joins two parties together, that fuses them together. In fact, that word, if you look at verse 24, it says, therefore a man will leave his father and mother and will be joined to his wife. When it says leave there, it is such a strong word. You'll find that same word in other places in the Old Testament, and they even translate it as forsake or reject. What God is calling Adam to do, what God calls married people to do, is a very strong thing. To turn your loyalties that once were to your family, to turn those aside, and now your primary loyalty goes to your spouse. You have to keep in mind when the Israelites would have heard this text for the first time, the Israelite culture was very family-oriented. Ancient Jewish culture, your family was really a key part of your life. You took care of your parents and well into their old age, usually until they passed away. Your family, you all kind of lived clustered together. Nowadays, we kind of, family disperses. You move cross-country, that's pretty typical. But in those days, your family was very tightly knit together. And even against the backdrop of that culture, God says, but still, your loyalty to your family must now be pushed so that it now looks like you're rejecting it compared to your new loyalty to your new spouse. Now, just for clarity, God is not saying don't care about your family anymore. He's not saying walk away from them and turn your back on them forever. He's saying your primary loyalty now belongs to your spouse. Your primary loyalty now belongs to your spouse. This is something so important. And I'll tell you why. If someone were to ask you, make a list of the top 5 sins that threaten a marriage, you might start with a list like, an addiction, affair, pornography, right? Some of those more obvious ones. But I'm not sure that you would put on that list failure to leave your family. But failure to do that can be every bit as destructive. It can be every bit as damaging to the health of your marriage. Right? Think back to my opening story. What was going wrong there on Honolulu Road when we're trying to decorate our house for Christmas? I hadn't really left my family yet. I hadn't really left my expectations and desires and the picture of what life ought to look like. It was still being shaped by my family growing up. I had to leave that. And some of you have, your marriage is one where you need to look at leaving some of that stuff behind. You might be the person that cares more about what your parents think, and they criticize your spouse and they talk down about them, but you don't want to hurt them. You don't want to rock the boat, so you don't say anything. And you let your parents just badmouth your spouse. You haven't left yet. Or when it comes time, like happens around September, October, because you got to start talking about where are we going to spend Thanksgiving? Where are we going to spend Christmas? And the temptation is to say, Mom and Dad are going to be really upset if we don't go there for Thanksgiving. And so you make those plans even though you know your spouse wants to do something, just your family. You haven't left yet. Sometimes the way that we need to leave is by working through a lot of the pain and the baggage, if you will, of the home that we grew up in. You bring that with you into marriage. You bring the pain and brokenness of your family of origin into marriage. And if you don't deal with it, if you don't look at that and work through it and come to grips with what it means for you, it will shape your marriage today. Leaving can mean that you address those issues from your past. And I think we can take this a step further. Because sometimes it's not our own immediate family that we're loyal to, it's something else. Your career. Your family, right? You get so wrapped up with your kids, you want to get them in sports and you want to get them in this activity and that activity that pretty soon that becomes so important to you that your marriage just gets put on the back burner. Or your career becomes so all-encompassing that you work evenings, you work weekends, you don't really make time for your spouse. You haven't left something behind. God says you need to leave that in order to focus on your spouse. And then the next part of it is to be joined to. Now, the Old English translation, like the Old King James, said leave and cleave. And it's great because it rhymes. The problem is cleaving is one of these words that can mean exactly opposite things, right? Cleave can mean you join, you tear apart, and it can mean you join together. But it's a good word, cleaving together. What does it mean? Little story here. When I was in elementary school, keep in mind I grew up in Canada where it gets very cold in the winter. And there was something we'd always try to do to the real little kids on the playground. If you've seen the movie A Christmas Story, you know where I'm going with this. If you haven't, here it comes. We tell the little kids, first graders, maybe second graders, hey, see that flagpole over there? Go lick it. It tastes good. And okay, before you judge me, just let me say something here. I was the victim of this too, and so it's kind of like, you pay your dues, okay? So don't be too harsh with me. You tell your kid, go lick that little flagpole or that metal fence post, and the little kid, wanting to please the older kids, okay, I'll do it, and then, right? It sticks because it's cold. Here's why I tell you that. It's biblical, by the way. You didn't know that, did you? It is. 2 Samuel chapter, I think it's 23:30. There's a passage where one of the Israelite soldiers holds in his hand a sword, a metal sword. And we read that the sword froze to his hand, or his hand froze to the sword. Same word that's used there is used in Genesis 2:24 when it talks about being joined together. Let me say it this way and then I'll explain. God wants your marriage to be like a tongue sticking to a flagpole. Now you're always going to remember that, aren't you? When you are cleaved together, when you are joined together, God intends that you're not just good friends. You're not just two people who share a household. You're two people that are fused together and joined together at every level, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, sexually, everything joined together. Fused together. Doesn't mean that you suddenly lose your identity. You're two individuals, but in marriage, it's like you're joined together and you create a third. You create a we. So there's an I, and then greater there's a we. There's an us. Sometimes what happens in marriage is you go through life and you become like train tracks, like you're two parallel lives just going on forever, but you're not connected. When you make your plans for vacation, when you plan out your budget, when you talk about parenting style, it's like I versus you, my way or your way, and which one will win this time? What you need to have is a we. Well, this is what I want, and this is what you want, but what do we want? How are we going to do this? That's what it is to be leaving, to be being joined together to create a third, and that's what, biblically, that's the picture of covenant. Now, I can imagine at this point some pushback, and I can imagine it coming in, at least in a couple of different ways. The first is probably from those that say, marriage is just outdated. It's sort of an old-fashioned structure that people created because they needed it, but we're past that now. And to that, I want to push back on that, because studies have shown, research has shown, that marriage does a couple things. It creates stability for society. And not only that, but it actually creates greater fulfillment for the individual in those who choose to get married. It was about 10 years ago, and it was a researcher, a professor. I forget where she was at. I want to say she was like out of Maryland or Minnesota, I think. One of the M states, I think. Her name was Barbara Defoe Whitehead. And she's not coming from a Christian point of view that I can just figure out at all. And I only tell you that because it kind of puts a window on what does What does social research tell us? And she testified before Congress. And she went on at length about how marriage is a building block to a stable society. And it's also important for emotional fulfillment for those who are married. In other words, she's pushing back against that idea that we don't really need marriage, it's outdated. She says, no, it creates more stability in society. Now again, you're wondering, well, why can't we just be committed? Why do we really need to get married? Why can't we just live together? Marriage is just a piece of paper. And here's my pushback on that. Here's my response to that. Don't settle for something like that. See, you can commit to a person, and you can say, look, I love you, we'll be together. You might even give yourself to that person emotionally, sexually, spiritually to a point. But you're always keeping a door open to get out. You haven't given yourself fully to another person. You haven't committed. You're saying, I want to be committed, but I want an emergency exit just in case. And God says, don't settle for that. The whole purpose of leaving and cleaving is that you give yourself completely and entirely to another person. I can imagine one more sort of pushback or yeah, but kind of things, and that's maybe you are married. And you're thinking, this is all good, ideal. This is great, lofty stuff, but you don't understand the reality of it. It's nice in theory, but in practice, it's much different. So what do I say to you? Well, the first is you're not alone. There are many marriages all marriages go through ups and downs. And so if you're in kind of a down place, you're not alone. I'd encourage you to look for some help. Don't be afraid. Don't be shy about reaching out and getting help. Don't leave it for too long. But then I'd say, look big. What is the picture that God intends marriage to create? And the answer is that God doesn't want marriage just to be marriage. He wants it to be a window in which we see God. He wants marriage to point to something so much bigger. He wants marriage to point to His relationship with us. And so begin to ask yourself, well, how does God love us? How does God keep His commitments to us? If you're in that place where it's tough to keep that commitment to your spouse, ask yourself, how does God keep His commitment to us? What does it cost God to keep His commitment to us? And the answer is, it cost God's Son leaving His Father's presence and coming into this world and going to a cross and suffering and being forsaken by His Father and dying so that He might be joined to you, to me, to His church. If you're in a place where your marriage is really rocky, one of the things you can do is fill your mind with that picture, with that greatness of God's covenant, leaving and cleaving love. And when you do that, it doesn't magically make all your problems disappear, but it creates a foundation. It creates a framework that you live out of. It creates a place to build your marriage on. See, a marriage is only as strong as the foundation. And the marriages that we have are meant to be built on the foundation of Christ and His love for us. So are you building on that foundation? If you're thinking about getting married, are you putting that in front of you as the foundation to build on? If you're a single person, do you realize that this includes you too? Because you are part of the bride of Christ. You are loved every bit as much. You're included. You experience that covenant, leaving and cleaving love of God as well. Build on that foundation. Live out of that foundation. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, nowhere do you promise or guarantee that marriage is or will come easy to us.